Women then in the early 70s made 52 cents for every dollar a man made. Today, we're up to 83 cents. So we still have a ways to go. It's not usual that it's different pay for the same job. It's the jobs that women predominate in, whether it's teaching or secretarial work, are paid less. And of course, the biggest job women have, motherhood, isn't paid at all. I gave my sister, who has 3 children, a t-shirt that said, "Every mother is a working mother," you know. Back in those days, a woman could not get any credit without her husband's signature. Now, credit cards didn't exist yet, but if you wanted to borrow money from a bank, you had to get your husband's approval first. The biggest source of scholarships for women in those years was the Miss America pageant. And to talk about jobs, a job that many women aspired to in those years was called stewardess. And you had to be white, you had to be unmarried, and you had to be thin. Stewardesses were weighed every single week to make sure they did not gain too much weight. They were expected not to object if men reached for them or made remarks, and they were fired if they got married. So we have come a long way. Now, in terms of authority, this is the one that's almost hardest to convey, but almost all politicians, all college professors, all principals, all military officers and men in the military, all doctors, all religious leaders were male. And it was just assumed that that was the case. There was an old joke that I can't remember. It wasn't really a joke. It was a person being brought in for surgery. And the doctor says, "I can't operate." And they said, "But you're not her father." Well, it was her mother. And nobody got it in those years because female doctors were so, rare. When I went to graduate school and college, I never had a female professor. They really didn't exist. There were few of them. There were many more professors and doctors who were women back in the 1920s and 30s, but they disappeared after World War II, and I'll go into that more a little later. All voiceovers on radio and television were male. The only position that a woman occasionally held was as weather girl, right? And she had to be cute. And in common speech, men came first, men and women, kings and queens, husband and wife. And when my friend Judy Zinser and I wrote our book of History of Women in Europe, we deliberately reversed it. And it was quite awkward for us in the first, queens and kings, women and men, but it really makes a tremendous difference. To give you an example from most histories, women were, quote, given the vote. We weren't given the vote. We fought for it for well over 100 years. And, in England, they had hunger strikes. People were force-fed. It was a very arduous battle. Now, in terms of authority, if you got married in those years, and of course, the only marriage was hetero marriage, a woman promised to love, honor, and obey her husband. A husband promised to love and honor his wife. And this one, my mother told me about first. Women were routinely excluded from juries because it was felt both that they couldn't be objective enough to be a good juror, and they had responsibilities at home. And this lasted into the middle of the 20th century. The final law cases overturning these decisions happened in the 1970s. So that brings me to the perhaps more interesting subject of sex and gender. It's interesting in the Chinese curse sense of the word interesting. Female teachers were fired if they were pregnant, just like stewardesses. You weren't supposed to show pregnancy in front of innocent children. And in any profession, there was no possibility of complaint if a boss got fresh with you. It was standard. It was absolutely standard. It was the subject of many jokes, many cartoons in places like the New Yorker. It was just absolutely routine. It was very hard for single women who were always called Miss to rent an apartment or to get service at either a restaurant or bar or to rent a room in a hotel, because it was assumed you were either a prostitute or a lesbian. Take your choice. You know, when the word Ms. finally came in, I remember the New York Times fought it for about 15 years. They didn't like it, you know, and they refused to use it. And then finally they used it. Now, in terms of contraception, contraception was illegal in this country until 1965. I mean, a lot of people used it. Men would go to the back of a drugstore and whisper for condoms. But the case Griswold v. Connecticut in front of the Supreme Court in 1965 said that married couples could use contraception. The right was not applied to unmarried people until 1972. Which brings me to the fraught topic of abortion. I am old enough to remember when abortion was illegal, and it was terrible. It wasn't that women stopped getting abortions, they got unsafe abortions. Every hospital had what was called a septic ward, and that was where women who had major infections from illegal abortions were put, and many of them died. In 1965, when abortion was still illegal, my best friend Enid got pregnant right out of college, and she didn't want to have a baby. So we asked everybody we knew except our mothers. You know, we thought our mothers would disapprove. And we found an MD, which was really good, you know, not some back alley practitioner. And he agreed to perform a D&C, dilation and curettage on her for $900. In 1965. I looked it up and it's worth $7,500 today. She had 300, the guy who became her husband had 300, and I loaned her 300, and it took her a long time to pay it back. My first job out of college, I made $4,000 a year, and that was normal. So he did a D&C with no anesthetic. She came out screaming and bleeding, but fortunately she was okay. And this was the best case scenario. These were upper class or, you know, upper middle class white women with connections. You know, imagine what it was like for poor women. So that's life before feminism. It really was the bad old days. You know, when I had to hear that expression, the good old days, they weren't good for women. Now I'm going to go to my life. And generally speaking, my life was pretty equal until I went to graduate school. And I'm going to add an except here, except for the clothes. I used to get dressed in front of my classes, you know, acted out. I loved the show Mad Men, and I really enjoyed watching the clothes on television, but boy, were they uncomfortable. You know, you had to wear a garter belt. You all know what that is?
Every day?
Every day to hold up your stockings. My first job working for the dictionary at American Heritage, I was told I had to wear a skirt and hose to work. And in those years, the mid 60s, I had a wonderful pantsuit. They were just coming in. And my husband and I went to an inn in New Jersey, and they refused us admission because I was wearing pants. You know, this happened to female attorneys who dared to wear pants in front of a judge. But I had a fairly equal life. Well, I did the garter belt. I mean, then the push-up bra, or what was then called a Merry Widow, which was a bra corset, and a slip, of course, and crinolines when the skirts stuck out in the 50s. And then, you know, itchy wool clothing. I mean, it was so uncomfortable. And heels, you had to wear heels. Flats were not admissible, and sneakers were for gym, you know, so it was very different. But as I say, it was fairly equal until I applied to go to graduate school. And I was admitted to Columbia University. I graduated summa cum laude from Brown, so I was considered an appropriate candidate, except for my sex. They gave you a welcoming pamphlet, and I put welcoming in quotes, which said, the ideal student is an unmarried man reflecting the monastic traditions of the Middle Ages. What? I mean, they want everybody to be a monk. And in my department and every department, fellowships were given out first to unmarried men, then to married men, then to unmarried women, and last of all, to my category, married women, because it was assumed that your husband would support you. I mean, there was one year when my husband was out of work and I had to support him, but it was still that arrangement. During my interview, I was asked, why should we give this position to you and take it from a man? You're just going to get pregnant. And I practically waved my diaphragm around the room.
Oh my God.
Now, when I would tell my students this, they would say, but that's illegal. I'd say, it is now. And that's the reason it's illegal. You know, they just assumed it had always been that way. My husband actually was extremely supportive of me. He convinced me to go on for my doctorate. I was ready to quit after the MA. It was okay until I began teaching. Columbia, like many universities, even today, has its graduate students do the teaching. And in those years, you were, of course, unpaid. It was the honor of the thing. And they never taught you how to teach. You know, you learned from bad professors or good professors. And the day before I started teaching, which is kind of nerve-wracking, you know, to get in front of a class and pontificate, the head of the Columbia History Department said to me, you know, Mrs. Anderson, Columbia students don't like women. And I went down to the street and I was standing on the pavement and I thought, if I were Black, and he said that to me, that would be wrong. And there's something wrong about this. You know, I had to really think by analogy because I was so used to women being treated that way in a sense. They then had a department meeting. It was a very large department, over 60 professors, one woman. She taught African history, and that was considered kind of so remote and nobody cared. And the head of the Columbia University department, not just Columbia College, but the university, introduced all the graduate students except two, me and the one other woman. And that was the moment for me. And I took all my courage in my hands and I went over to him and I said, excuse me, sir, you didn't introduce me and Amy Hackett, as it turns out, a friend of mine. And he said, excuse me, gentlemen, it seems that Mrs. Anderson here has a problem. I didn't introduce her. The next day I went out and I joined Columbia Women's Liberation. And you had to check off what committee you would be on. And I checked off the curriculum committee. I thought that would be interesting. And it was chaired by a graduate student named Kate Millett, whose name has kind of vanished today, but she was very prominent a few years later because she wrote a book called Sexual Politics, and she made the cover of Time magazine. So this group where we just discussed issues was a consciousness raising group. I mean, it didn't even have that name yet. But what we realized there was it wasn't just my problem, it was our problem. It was all women had problems with not wanting sex or embarrassment about menstruation, et cetera, et cetera. My former husband, we're friends today, and I still joke about one night. We lived on the 3rd floor in a brownstone, and he said to me, I'll take your garbage down. And I said to him, it's not my garbage, it's our garbage. But it was things like that that needed to be changed and were changed. And so I did become a feminist in my private life. But it took me a number of years before I adopted it in my professional life. I had joined a group that was always called the CCWHP, the Coordinating Committee for Women in the Historical Profession. And the goal of that group was to have more women on panels and chairing panels at conferences. There's a big history conference every year, as there is in most disciplines. And that led me to start thinking, where are the women in history? Didn't women do anything? What is women's history? You know, in American history, in those years, you'd heard of Molly Pitcher and maybe Dolly Madison, but hardly anybody, you know, generally the wives of presidents, but not independent women. So I decided to write a history of women in Europe, because in the late 70s, which is when we started, there were a number of histories of women in the United States, but there were none about women in Europe. Well, the remarks I got in those years, and these are verbatim, right? Absolutely what people said to me. Oh, a broad view of history? Snicker, snicker. Are you writing a history of diapers? Do women have any history? After a few years, I used to joke bitterly that I couldn't go to dinner parties anymore. And I like to tell you the story of just one. And this is, again, absolutely verbatim. A man said to me, he was sitting next to me at the dinner table, women can't leave because they're incapacitated for a week every month. And I said, and before I could speak, his wife said, yes, I have to go to bed for a week every month. And I said, well, I'm really sorry, but most women don't have that experience. And the husband kept going on and on about how women couldn't lead. And he was quite a chubby guy. So I turned to him and I said, you know, in ancient times, a man like you, who's not in great shape, I was being very tactful, couldn't be a leader. And he said to me, don't get personal. And I said, you're the one who raised the subject of menstruation at the dinner table. And when I left, a woman by the door whispered to me, you're right. And that happened a lot because, you know, the word feminist, you know, nobody wanted to be called a feminist. In fact, when I taught the history of feminism, I used to advertise it as the F word, you know. On another subject, it wasn't until the Me Too movement appeared only a few years ago, right, that I thought seriously about the sexual harassment that I had experienced in my life. When I was about 8 years old, I was walking home from school. People did that in those years. I grew up in New York City. And a man came up to me and whispered, did I know about, and I didn't know the word cunt. He said, so I said, cult, my cult. And I just walked away from him. And it took me quite a while to realize what he was talking about. A few years later, when I was 10, there was a man in the lobby of my building. He pulled out his erect penis and asked me if I wanted to play with it. And I said no, and went right upstairs. For years afterwards, I would walk past the door, which was a glass door, and make sure there was no one in the lobby. I mean, it really impacted on me. When I talked about these experiences much later, virtually every woman I knew had had similar experiences. It was the way the world was then, a number of them said to me, and I think it's true. When I was in graduate school at Columbia, this would have been in the late 60s, early 70s, a number of men exposed themselves to me, both on the subway and in libraries. At one point, there was an exhibitionist, as it was called, in the Columbia Stacks. And the Columbia Stacks, for those of you who haven't been in them, are a dark and scary place all by themselves. They go downstairs and there are no lights on. You have to flip a light on and it stays on for 15 minutes and then you have to flip it on again. And so the Columbia University's solution to the exhibitionist was to give every female researcher a whistle. And if he exposed himself to you, you were supposed to blow the whistle. I have no idea who would come. That was the way it was. When I told this story at a dinner party of hetero couples, including my husband, who was pretty good, all the men laughed and said they'd love it if a woman exposed herself to them. And the women all said, you don't get it. It's not about sex, it's about power. And they didn't get it. They just didn't get it. Years later, in the 1990s, I became a member of the graduate faculty of City University. When I joined, a female colleague told me, never get on an elevator with Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Now, he was an eminent historian. He wrote the biography of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I wasn't supposed to get on the elevator because he was known for goosing women, pinching their ass in the elevator. And so I never did. But that's all that was done. He was never stopped. He was never, admonished or much less fired. And in fact, when I told this story recently, a woman came up to me and said, do you know about when he visited, it was some Midwestern state, he was, a guest speaker. And he said to the host, when I go to my room, I want liquor and a hooker. And they gave him one.
Wow.
I mean, that I found hard to believe, but she swore it was true. So certain conditions have changed in my lifetime, but not enough. Grabbing a woman's pussy, as he put it, didn't stop Trump from getting elected, right? Christine Blasey Ford's accusations, as whether two other women's accusations of sexual harassment by Brett Kavanaugh, did not prevent him from making it to the Supreme Court. And that really shocked me. I wrote every single senator begging them not to confirm him, but it didn't make any difference. On the plus side, I was delighted when Biden appointed Kamala Harris as his vice president. And when she made her speech saying, I may be the first, but I won't be the last. I mean, tears were streaming down my face. It was just so wonderful. But I was then appalled by the Senate's recent treatment of Ketanji Brown Jackson. I mean, they never would have done that to a man. And I don't think they would have done it to a white woman. And I thought it was appalling, absolutely appalling. Asking her about child pornography. Could you define the word woman? I mean, nothing about her judicial career, which was so much better than all of theirs. I do believe she will be confirmed. There was an article this morning that Susan Collins will vote for her. Oh, thank you, Susan. I mean, it was like this, no one has been as well qualified as this woman. And I think it's great she's going to be on the court. When Ginsburg was asked, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, how many women should there be on the Supreme Court? She said 9. And with Jackson, it'll be 4. So that's pretty good. Now, all in all, my major point is women's history must be part of our daily lives, of our everyday behavior, not just an event in March. And we do have a number of resources available to us at this point. There are many websites that inflect women or have the word feminism in their title. I belong to a feminist historians collective that meets on Facebook. Now, someone years ago, when I took out a classified ad as looking for a date, I said I was a historian. A man wrote back to me and he said, I've never met a historian, but then again, who has? And I think that's true, but there are many resources available. And I want to recommend a wonderful book to you. It's by Jennifer Baumgartner and Amy Richards. It's called Manifesta, instead of manifesto, Young Women, Feminism, and the Future. And it's a wonderful book. I used it when I taught the history of feminism. It was the final reading of the course, and they all loved it. They really loved it. So if you just remember Manifesta with an A, you'll find it. For a view of the past, I tell people, as I told my freshman students, talk to your grandmother, right? She'll remember what happened. I used to ask my freshmen to talk to someone over 65, and they said, I don't know anybody that old. And I said, if you don't have a grandmother, find someone in your neighborhood. And I got a wonderful paper from someone who interviewed the woman who ran his local laundromat, or a druggist. I mean, there are just many ways to do this, right? So in ending, I want to describe a birthday card that my oldest friend and writing partner gave to me. This was my friend Judith Zinzer. We met in 9th grade, and our friendship survived writing a book together, but barely. So the card has a picture of a birthday cake with candles on the front, and it says, a feminist birthday cake. And you open it up and it says, they're not candles, they're the patriarchy going up in flames. So a friend of mine said you should really define the word patriarchy, but I think by now it's pretty clear, right? It's the rule of men in all areas of life. And I think it's disappearing, but may it, you know, things become truly equal. Thank you. We have time for questions. Do people have questions?
Anybody on the Zoom want to start off asking Bonnie a question?
Absolutely. All right. So go talk to your grandmother or someone over 65. What would you suggest for maybe starter discussion topics?
Well, I mean, I think you can just say, what was life like when you were 18? You know, what choices did you feel you had? What kind of work was available to you? What were your expectations? When you got married, what was the share of labor? You know, basically men worked outside the home. Women worked inside the home, but they were never paid for it. And that's a tremendous difference, you know, as those of us who have worked for no money know. And that's how I would do it. Yeah. And I haven't even started on childcare. I mean, you know, spending time with little children is, to me, one of the most exhausting things you can do. And yet that's considered women's, quote, work. You're expected to come to it naturally. And, you know, it's really, really difficult and really, really important. And it's never valued by any society.
I believe you had a story about your mother being interviewed and asked a question about what if your child had a fever and you were at work and had to do something, what would you do?
No, I don't remember that. I'm sorry. I guess she'd call a doctor. I mean, I remember the doctor coming to our house. He was, of course, a man, and it was like the king came to our house. She had a special towel for him. You know, it was always Dr. Fisher. And, you know, doctors did come to your house at that time. But so it was very, very different. Yeah.
I have a question. I would love to get your thoughts on what exactly did you feel and think when you heard Senator Marsha ask Ketanji Jackson to define the word woman? Because I felt like the question was so loaded. There were so many things wrong with that question. To just see specifically to see a white woman asking this Black woman in power to define the word woman, and then even further the context, I feel she tried to clean up as to why she was asking her that question. So what were your thoughts on that?
Well, to be honest with you, I couldn't listen. You know, I could not watch it. It made me too upset and too angry. So I read about it in the newspaper. And first of all, that question has nothing to do with Judge Jackson's career.
Yeah.
Right? Nothing at all. And I think it was incredibly loaded because of transitioning people. You know, are you a quote woman or a real woman? I'm putting quotation marks around it because one of the people I know quite well, a colleague of mine, transitioned from being female to male. And he's terrific. I mean, he's bald, but he's really good. He's a wonderful professor. He's a wonderful father. I mean, it was right for him. Mm-hmm. And this business about don't say gay and don't allow any discussion of homosexuality or transitioning people, I think is outrageous. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it was Alexis de Tocqueville said, there's no such thing as a little bit of censorship. You know, once you start to censor, and that's why college academics used to have freedom of speech. It's being encroached upon every minute, you know, because if you can't, you know, we have these big brains for a reason. You know, we need to understand reality, not someone's version of reality. We need to probe what is believed or discussed or questioned. You know, I mean, that was why. And that to me was one of the most outrageous moments of the hearings.
Yeah.
I have a question if you had a minute. So just to introduce myself, I'm actually outside of the US, but a lot of this still resonates. I'm up in Canada. But recently there's actually been a controversy in certain universities because certain positions were actually, to even postulate on the position, there was an exclusion. No white males could actually apply for those positions. And it's created quite a controversy. I understand the past and everything else, but it is an interesting, I find it's a slippery slope to start excluding people, even though it is for a better purpose of trying to gain better equality and to kind of right the wrongs of the past. But I kind of would like to hear kind of your thoughts on how we should approach those kind of issues.
Well, I agree with you, and I have a number of white male students who have literally been told the same thing. I think the best person should get the job. Now, in the past, women were automatically excluded. Nobody had to say, let's not hire a woman. I remember there was a position in American Studies, and my office mate, who was an older white man, said, I don't think we should hire so-and-so. She has a big butt. Now, would he have said that about a man? But I am not for any kind of exclusion in that regard. But I do think the balance does need to be righted in some way. If you have an all-white faculty, shouldn't you look for a Black person? I don't think you should exclude a really talented white teacher who's better than any Black candidate, but is that going to be the case very often? I don't think so. So it's a balancing act. It's difficult. Obviously, they're very talented white men and they should be hired, but they're also very talented Black women who should be hired as well. And they were automatically excluded for so many years.
I'd also like
homosexuals, they were just automatically, you had to be in the closet or you couldn't be near college students because you might have sex with them. There was just so much exclusion. So I don't believe in exclusion, but I do believe in quality. I don't know if that helps.
I do think it's also worth deconstructing saying talented, right? Because the reason that I think we also find so many white men and so many white people in a lot of, like the higher paying roles and positions of power, talented is it's not just like, it's not someone who just like has a great jump shot the first time they tried to shoot, right? It's cultivation, it's access to resources,
Absolutely.
It's lots of things that are very, genderized in exclusion as well, as race and class and so many other things. So I think that's hard, right? Because like, let's say that really talented white man, and there's like a Black candidate that's also talented, but they think the man is more talented. It's like, yeah, there's only one Black candidate for a reason. And that has to do with class. And that has to do with, with white supremacy, right? Like that has to do with how many people have
Absolutely.
gotten to the point to even be considered a candidate. And so
Right.
I think that's what's hard about that.
No, you're right. White men can't jump. But there's so much prejudice still in society about education, about incarceration. Don't get me started on that. And so many systems have perpetuated what prevailed in the Confederacy. We don't have actual slavery anymore. We have wage slavery. And I think America is both tragic and hopeful at the same time. We have tragic things in our past that we have to acknowledge. When people criticize critical race theory, to me, that's actual American history. That's what really happened. And to not know what really happened, we're not going to be able to do anything about the present, much less the future. So that's how I feel about it.
Were there any people of color or women of color at Columbia when you were going there?
The fact that I have to think about it.
Yeah.
There weren't. Now, Brown was much better. Brown, where I went to undergrad, I had a number of Black classmates, and one of them, Dick Nurse, became head of admissions at Brown. And Brown decided to be the forefront of the Ivy League in recruiting Black students. They wanted 13% of their students to be Black, reflecting the population of the United States. They formed a partnership with Tougaloo College in Mississippi, and within a few years, they were 13% Black. So that was much more hopeful. Columbia was known as being not only anti-Black, but anti-Semitic. They didn't have a Jewish professor in New York City until the late 50s. And then they had, it was a class, I think the class of 1964, they decided to take people just on academic ability and SAT scores, and it was 95% Jewish, and they never did it again. You know, you have the same issue to some degree in California with Asian students. But no, not at Columbia. And as I said, I never had a female professor.
Yeah.
So you became one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and I had to overcome my students would tend to call me Mrs. Anderson, like I was a high school teacher. And I said, no, I'm Professor Anderson. You know, I had to insist on the title, so they knew. I taught a wonderful course back in '88 with a colleague who was male, and he would say, call me Teo, you know, his first name. And I would say, call me Professor Anderson. And then, you know, eventually we could go to a first name basis.
I have a question. I think something that oftentimes in the workplace, and it's kind of a thing that I feel like we all struggle with, and it's not apparent unless I feel like very often you are a woman, in that a lot of the administrative work, or even work where, you know, for instance, you're having a meal and there needs to be cleanup, the people who are always cleaning up are the women. And the question is like, how do we approach something like that? Because it's I think something that's like, one, ingrained, but two, it seems like it's never something that's spoken about, whereas it happens, I feel like, every day.
I think you're absolutely right. And what I would do is turn the tables. Could you please get me a cup of coffee? You know, would you mind cleaning up the table? I mean, I'm addressing the two men in the room. But that's the only way I can see to do it. In my field, academia, women, and particularly if there were women of color, were always put on every single committee. So we can show how diverse we are. Well, that meant you had to do so much more work than the men, you know? So that's a real issue as well. And in my own department, the African-American man retired, and we ended up hiring an Indian woman who was a Brahmin, and the upper class of Indian American society. It was very difficult for a place like Brooklyn College to find a Black PhD because they all went to Princeton and Yale and Harvard. And Gunja, my friend who was the Indian, was always on every single committee to show diversity, you know, and it was sham diversity. You know, she was the elite of Indian American society. So it's a real issue, but as I say, turn the tables, literally.
On that note, I know a lot of men may feel a little bothered. Not that I'm trying to protect men at all, but like, what do you say to them that they might feel a little uncomfortable hearing these kinds of things? Like, how do you encourage them to lean in and sort of like be a part of the momentum forward for women?
Well, I mean, I can't say I dislike men. I was married to two of them. And I think if you just, you know, express your affection or friendship without getting sexual, you know, it's a fine line.
Yeah,
it really
yeah.
is. And if they start, say, you know, I really like you as a friend. I don't want to go any further. Most men will listen to that, you know, and they're not that delicate. You know?
There he goes.
Well, yes. I mean, everybody's delicate. Everybody is vulnerable and has an ego and doesn't want to be dissed and, you know, stomped on. And I really try to treat people equally that way, you know.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not sure if you're aware, but tech is one of those industries that has a diversity problem, specifically with the ratio from men to women. So do you think that it's as simple as men just like amplifying the voices of the women in the workplace? Is it mentorship? What do you think is the answer?
Well, we had a program at Brooklyn College that worked really well. It was to get women into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And what they did, and I could make you guess for a while, and you probably wouldn't, was they formed a basketball team.
What? Sorry.
And the women played basketball together. And it got them used to helping each other, encouraging each other, passing the ball. And it really worked. We had many more women going into STEM because of that, because they made a group with each other, and they supported each other, and they were used to passing the ball and doing all that together. So I thought that was a neat program. And I think that's where it has to begin. It can't begin really in the math class. I mean, it can. One time we had a male professor of mathematics at Brooklyn who said students needed to know how to measure so they could measure the length of their penises. And we didn't get him fired, but we certainly got him rebuked and told never to say that again. Can you imagine? So I don't think that's the place to begin. The place to begin is probably in early childhood education. And I think that's been happening more and more. I see more and more books for kids about women scientists and women in astronomy and mathematics, and and boys in ballet and the arts and playing music. I think we're both happier if we can be human and do what humans do, whatever we're whatever we want to and have the capacity to do. I know back in the day, not that long ago, men weren't supposed to cry. It was unmanly, tears were female. And how awful is that? Of course, everybody has to cry at some point. And it doesn't make you a sissy. It doesn't make you unmanly. It makes you human. So that's where I stand.
I love it. We don't have any more questions. Oh, there's no questions in the chat.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So I know you had mentioned the Manifesta book. I'm curious if you have other books, like maybe that you taught, or other recommendations.
Honestly, I'm kind of out of date. I retired in 2005 and I haven't taught history of feminism since. So I'm sorry, I'm not really the person to ask. I will, in a shameless bit of self-promotion, tout my latest book, which is about a marvelous woman whose name was Ernestine Rose, whom nobody has ever heard of today. And she was born in 1810, the daughter of a rabbi in Poland, and she became a real feminist in the 1850s. So there's so much to learn about, but I'm sorry, I just can't tell you about recent books.
No, that's a good answer. I have a second question. So you haven't, I know you mentioned you were married twice. You haven't mentioned if you had children or not, which you don't need to, but I was just curious how you've seen that and it develop as I'm an engineer, so professional woman, not having children, and how you've seen that all change or not change, because I feel like I'm asked constantly still this year about why don't you have kids?
I think it's changed much too little. A good friend of mine who happens to be the wife of Ed Rabin here just finished a film which is terrific. It's called My So-Called Selfish Life, Women Who Don't Have Children. So it'll be playing in a few months. It's gone to festivals right now and it is terrific. But I was always asked, if I gained a little weight here, are you pregnant? Can I hope? That's one of my boyfriend's mothers said to me. And I said, no, you can't. But it puts women, and of course not men, in a very difficult position, because men are never asked, when are you going to have children? Don't you want to be a father? What's wrong with you? And women always are. And I think they still are. So, just none of your business might be a little crude, but it really isn't. It's just none of your business. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but.
No, that is, no, thanks. I hadn't heard of that movie. Ed, you've been holding out.
No, it's going to be coming out, it's still, when you show a film at festivals, you can't have it in full, broadcast appeal. And I think it's going to go first to colleges. So keep your eyes open. Or ask Ed.
Awesome, thanks.
Anybody else on the Zoom have questions? We have another 10 minutes with Bonnie.
I have a question. I guess there's, as you've been speaking, and thank you, first of all, for speaking to us. It's been really awesome to listen to you. I think there's a lot of things right now to point to that might suggest that we're regressing. I mean, you have all over America this attack on abortion. You have, the inability to say gay. You have these attack on trans, across the board. There seems like there's so much regression, and I feel like since 2016, but at least, but probably earlier, we've been hearing, well, don't be too, everything looks really bad, but it's going to get better. Don't worry. A lot of reason to say, just hold on a little bit. It's not as bad as you think. But then it seems to get worse. And then you have, a few things where, oh my gosh, I'm with you. When Kamala Harris made her speech, I was in tears as well. And you get all these, amazing moments. But then behind the scenes, there's so much negativity happening. So anyway, I have that in my head a lot lately. I'm sure a lot of people do. I guess my question is just, do you feel like we're regressing? Are you concerned about where we are?
I'm very concerned. And the election of, I want to spit, Trump made sentiments that had been really unacceptable, not only acceptable, but desirable. So the phrase politically correct always seemed to me to be incorrect, because what we were talking about was common courtesy. So yes, I do think we've gone, in a sense, backwards. And the problem with abortion is the major one. And this business about fetal heartbeats, when it's like as big as a lima bean. So what I have done is, I used to give money to various charities. I now put it all into politics, because to me, this is a political issue. And I personally feel the Republicans have two things going for them. They're against voting rights and they're against women. And I think both of them are losing strategies. And if I were the head of the Democratic Party, I would talk that until I was blue in the face. And I think they're going to lose big in 2022. I mean, I hope, if not, we'll have to keep on fighting. But as I say, that's where I'm putting all my money and all my energy. I'm about to start writing letters to Democrats who might not vote. But I mean, my sister used to be a Republican. She was a moderate Republican. Mm-hmm. After Trump, she's now a Democrat. And last year, she did the first activist thing she ever has done. Actually for 2020, she wrote letters to people. She'd never done that before. So I think there are people like that, as well as people who, in a sense, want to go backwards. My half-brother, who was an old, white, angry man, was completely for all this stuff. And the day Obama was elected, he called me up and he said, but where was he born? I said, don't even start with me. I will cream you. He was an old guy. I think people who have these sentiments tend not to get vaccinated. They're going to die. That's awful to say, but I think time is on our side. And we've got so many young people who do think and do feel and do have sex and, need all these values. So I'm basically a hopeful person, but I hope my hopes aren't dashed.
I have, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, sure.
Okay, I do have one question, and it's a rather taboo conversation that I've seen circulating more in regards to gender.
Mhm.
So there are a lot of conversations around the erasure of the cisgendered woman, the woman who was born female. And there's been the conversation of certain things like saying breastfeeding is now inappropriate, it's chest feeding, to be more inclusive of birthing people who are transitioned from female to male. And the conversation is sparking a lot more of like, okay, we are like for inclusion, but where exactly does the cisgendered woman fit in without feeling now excluded from the conversation?
I've never heard that expression, chest feeding.
Yeah,
I
so
mean, you don't feed from your chest, you feed from your breast, right?
Yeah.
And a woman who's transitioned has breasts.
yeah,
you
but
know.
it's actually now inappropriate to say like breastfeeding.
You
because
know,
of all
often
birthing
movements
people.
go too far before
Yeah.
they settle where they really should be. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking of opposition to the Vietnam War. One of the first marches I went on, someone carried a pig's head, a literal pig's head on a pole and said, "That's the army." And I didn't want to march behind that, but I did, because I was so against the war. And that was going too far.
Yeah.
And I think this is going a little too far as well. There's an issue of should men who transition, who became female, be on women's sports teams? I think they probably should. Should they be in women's colleges? I think they probably should, but I'm guessing, and I think we'll have to work these things out. But the answer is not to say, don't let anybody transition. I mean, that's not an easy process. And the people who do it go through a lot of pain, both physical and emotional, to get where they feel they ought to be, it's not easy, but it's better than it used to be, When I was a child, I really wanted to be a boy because boys could do everything. And I didn't want a boy's body. I just wanted to be able to run and climb trees and not wear dresses and stuff like that. What does that make me? I mean, I'm a cis woman, At one point, one of my stepdaughters said, you should get in touch with your inner lesbian. I said, I don't think she's there. And at one point, the women's movement was kind of saying, if you were a woman like myself, you were consorting with the enemy. And I don't think you can change your sexuality. I think it's kind of a given, and I think the same with your gender identity. There's a wonderful book that's an old book now called Conundrum that was written by a man who was a very successful historian of the British Empire. He was married, happily married with 4 children. He always felt he was in the wrong body, that he really was a woman, and he transitioned. He's still friends with his wife. Her name is now Jan Morris. It was James Morris. I think she died a year or so ago, but she was a very successful writer, whether being a man or a woman. She remained friends with her former wife. She remained close to her children. I mean, these things do happen today, and I'm glad they're able to. So,
I have a question.
yeah.
So as an activist and professionally an academic, what do you do to restore your energy? Like when you're exhausted and you've experienced
I watch a lot of junk television.
Ooh, what are you watching?
Right now, I'm watching a fun thing called Line of Duty that's about corruption in the British police force. And I watched The Man in the High Castle, which is 7 seasons of an alternate future that I thought was terrific. I read junk books. I read mysteries. I read romances. And I talk to my friends.
Nice.
I believe friendship is so important and is so underrated, I wouldn't be anywhere without my friends.
All right, we're gonna give one last chance for a last question before we wrap up. Anybody have anything pressing to say?
Yeah.
Oh.
Sorry, I don't want to talk over anybody, but just very quickly, I want to take you home with me. How do we stay in touch with you?
I'm happy in my home, but thank you very much. Ed, you want to to say something?
Oh, so in the 1619 project, in the book by Nicole Hannah Jones, well, edited by Nicole Hannah Jones, one of her, a thesis that she puts forth is that the only reason anybody in America has rights and was able to succeed in the civil rights struggle is because Black Americans were first able to gain their emancipation and then gain their civil rights, and that they led, and that nobody else would have been able to benefit from democracy in America if that hadn't happened. I'm just wondering if you're familiar with that. Any thoughts on it?
I'm not actually, and I don't agree with it because of the women I studied in the 1850s. Because most of people in the early women's movement, which was not racially biased, because most of them came out of the abolitionist movement. So Black women and white women shared a stage. You know, I'm thinking about Sojourner Truth or Mary Ellen Watkins Harper. I mean, there were a number of cases like this. The woman I mentioned, Ernestine Rose, when she died, Frederick Douglass said she and her husband treated me absolutely as a friend. You know, they made up for a lot of the rebuffs I had from other people. So I think feminists led the way, and then the Black civil rights movement has waxed and waned with American history. I mean, obviously under the Confederacy, things were horrible, but right after, in Reconstruction, you have amazing Black movement, and it's absolutely crushed by Jim Crow. And it takes a long time. I mean, look at America, you know, Black American troops in the world wars fighting for equality and coming home and being discriminated against, you know. So the civil rights movement that I know about is post-World War II. And that was the one that, you know, succeeded as much as it has succeeded. And obviously it's not complete. It's like women, you know. So. But I haven't read the 1619 project. I tend not to read history anymore.
There's a great, they have a podcast on it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so if you prefer to listen,
Okay.
it's actually really good.
No, I've heard of it and I think it's wonderful, you know, just the
Excellent
title
work.
alone.
Yeah.
Uh,
All right, guys, we're at time. I don't know if you want to share any information before we
Well, I
leave.
have a website,
Mhm.
which is easy. It's bonnieanderson.com.
Nice.
And it's SON.
So that answers your question, Eric, about how we can keep in touch.
Yeah. You can have me in your home.
Bonnie, we sincerely thank you. Thank you for joining us today and giving us insight and perspective with women and what we've contributed and how great we are. All right. Thank you so much, guys.